how it is interpreted and all. If you can you talk about Sharia in some lines so that it is understood by Muslims also and by non-Muslims, that what is Sharia that they are afraid of?
Right. So Sharia basically is the name of divine law. You see, the Quran has revealed certain guidelines, certain principles, which are presented as guidelines, I would say, as rules, as principles, as regulations that we need to follow. And they are very few, they are very precise, as statutes, as rules and principles ought to be. They are like a couple of liners. And the system that should be evolved on the basis of those principles is left to each country, to each society, to each era of time. Because it's like saying that we have to follow a particular principle, but the model of following that principle can vary from place to place. So the Sharia is just a set of rules which the Almighty has revealed to mankind so that they can spend their lives in this world as better individuals, as more contributing individuals. And this Sharia basically, as I said, is very succinct, it's very precise, and it can be actually laid down in the form of bullet points. So because these are guidelines. So this is what the Quran has actually done. And again, the derivation of certain details from those guidelines is a human endeavor, and it has been left to us. And that is why there's always a chance of variation, there's always a chance of difference of opinion, which we have to accept. And as I said, as long as we hold to those principles, the interpretation of those principles is always something which God has allowed us to do, as long as we have the competence to interpret those principles, and that is all. The problem is that what we have done is that we have equated man-made laws with divine laws. We have equated the interpretation of Sharia to the Sharia itself. So it's like equating the interpretation of the Constitution of the United States with the Constitution itself. Interpretation is something which is done after that. It is done on that. It is something of an understanding. So what we have done is we have given the same divine status to the interpretation of the Sharia as the Sharia itself has, which is of course not right, because interpretation is not done by God, it is done by human beings. The Sharia is given by God. So the Sharia is divine, but the interpretation is not divine. It's a human endeavor, and hence we have to give it due regard. We cannot equate it to the divine Sharia. And today what happens, or what has been actually happening in the last millennium, I would say, in the Muslim world, is that the interpretation of the Sharia, which has been done by human beings, has been given the same reverence or the same status as the Sharia given by God Himself. And this has caused such a big mess that we have not yet actually come out of it. And if you ask me, we are going deeper into it because we are not making this distinction. That we have to keep the two separate. One is the divine and one is the temporal time. The thing is that we don't find time for the scripture. So finding time for the scripture, because you see, the biggest asset that I have is my God connection. That strength of the connection is my asset. And the way to build up that connection is to have a connection with the scripture, because the biggest manifestation of the divine is the word that He has sent.
Nowadays, parents are very concerned in the US and the Western world about their children, that they are distancing themselves from those who are followers of Islam, from being a Muslim or Islamic tradition or Quran and Islam. So what do you have to say to the parents or the youth, like how should we manage that situation, which is happening quite a bit and we are lost in that?
I think this is a very important and a very good question that you have raised, and I just have one answer to this, and I think that if we pay heed perhaps to this, then the task before us would become a lot easier. And that is that when we would like to educate our children regarding Islam and the imports of Islam or the precepts of Islam, we must not impose Islam on the children as if they have to follow something. We must reason it out to them. We must tell them that if for example, Islam wants us to fast in Ramadan, or it wants us to pray 5 times a day, or it has prohibited us to consume liquor or pork, then what is the reason behind it? Because you see, the reason is based in the Quran on common sense, on a certain rationale. Because I do think that if we communicate that rationale to our next generation, even to Muslims of our own contemporary era, it is a line of communication that we can adopt, and this is something which can, if we adopt the proper reasoning, it can really be communicated, because you see, the Quran says that whatever it has presented to us has to be weighed in the scales of reason, and the Almighty has tried to communicate it on the basis of reason, and He expects us to communicate it further on the basis of the same, which is reasoning, to other people. So instead of forcing our children to get up early in the morning to pray Fajr and telling them off or taking them off or not doing so, let's start and sit with them and tell them why are Muslims called to prayer, or they are asked to pray 5 times a day. What is the rationale behind praying?
Well, that will demand them to be educated and them to
That
make
is it.
sure
So
that they are conscious of it.
Absolutely. So the first thing is that the parents need to get themselves educated on these things, and also give time to their children. So I would sum it up by saying that instead of teaching Islam or religion as a dogma, let's teach it as a discipline.
Okay.
For example, when you teach physics or chemistry or a certain science to a child or to a grown-up, what do? You present the reasoning in favor of a particular theory.
Yep.
And you tell the reasoning, the counter reasoning which other people might have. And this is how human mind works. It grasps that reasoning, adopts that reasoning, or criticizes that reasoning. So in a similar way, instead of dogmatically enforcing religion, we must present the reasoning behind a certain statute, and of course brace ourselves as well regarding that reasoning.
That's right. Thank you. I would like, because you are from Pakistan, and I guess you are also a transnational or a multinational or cultural person, coming to a bit of to Pakistanis in general, what have you found something that Pakistani parents have some good practices and some that are not so good?
As I said earlier on, the biggest drawbacks of our Pakistani parents is not realizing the pressures which children go through when they are in their age. They don't realize the peer pressure, they don't realize the mindset of a growing up child. So instead of living with the child, instead of making friends with the child, instead of trying to understand the problems which the child might be going through, they are more dictators, they are more enforcers of
So you
their
were
will.
talking about this for Pakistani parents, not in general.
I said that I think that this is particularly true of Pakistani parents and the third world countries, but in the first world also we find glimpses of this attitude in certain areas. Although what happens here is that because at a very early age children have this liberty to move away from their parents, so they don't get the brunt of that nasty attitude, and because this I would say value of freedom and liberty has the greatest show in the West, because the biggest thing that you can show off is that you are free and you have the liberty to do whatever you like. So it has actually gone to the other extreme.
I want you to tell me something that Americans should know about Pakistanis in a cordial and amicable way that they are missing on knowing about Pakistan, and something that Pakistanis should know about Americans, because you do travel, something that you think that they are missing the information that is good about each other.
When Pakistanis come to the US, they become disciplined and they become individuals who follow the rules, because the tradition here is that it's your second nature to follow rules. It's like part of your personality, because as soon as you open your eyes, you find the whole environment following a certain discipline. So I think the biggest lesson which the third world countries should learn or know about these first world countries, or maybe individuals or children from the United States, is that it becomes so easy when you go to a society which follows certain rules and a set of rules to be amongst them, because it's like you don't need to actually exercise any extra effort, because the whole drive is in that direction. And the respect for the rule of law is something which Muslims or people from Pakistan should learn when they come to Western societies, that it's the respect for the rule of law which is so prevalent, and to be able to come together as compassionate individuals. And the two things which stand out in these Western societies is, one of them I call the thank you culture, and the other one I call the sorry culture. Thank you culture is that you're always thanking the other person, and you're always apologizing to the other person. It's such a beautiful thing, that I'm sorry for that and thank you very much. So these are the three things I think that perhaps they can really learn. And the things which Americans perhaps can learn from societies like Pakistan are these family values,
Yeah.
the closeness of a family, the warmth of a father and a mother, or a grandparent, because it is here that we find in the West that families, there are so many families which are now single parent families. Very, very tragically, at a very early age, we find single parent families, and this actually deprives the child of some of the traits which have to be transferred from the other gender. And that's how at times they become incomplete individuals. Fortunately, in Pakistan or in many other Muslim countries, we still have that bonding, we still have that family culture in which we can depend on our family, in which we can count on them, in which we can become closer to them. Although I might dare say this, that this is breaking now, even in the East as well.
Yeah.
We are finding some cracks and some fissures there as well, but still the fabric is very much intact. Although it's deteriorating, although it might in the next 10 or 15 years a lot might change, but even in these changing circumstances, they still have a lot of very strong familial ties. And it's not that the US or the Western societies don't have that, because here also we have very strong family bonds and very strong family relationships in many parts of the US. It's only because of the fact that children move out of their houses at a very early time, and this independence which comes to them at a very early age, this sort of weakens that family bond, and it makes a person more, if I use the word with respect, it makes a person more selfish and more self-centered. And in spite of the fact that they are still selfless in many other areas, because the way people behave here is that they're very selfless, but in matters of relationships, they become slightly more selfish.
Yeah.
And perhaps it is here that they can learn something from Pakistanis.
Yes.